This lecture makes use of clickers. I don't know if any of you are familiar with clickers. Obviously, unfortunately, we don't have enough clickers for everyone. So the way we normally do this is we give each section 10 clickers. And you can share amongst each other within the section. But unfortunately also, in the past, we've had clickers not being returned at the end of the session. So please today, for the students, when you take a clicker, please present your ID. And then at the end of the lecture, you can exchange the ID for a clicker. Right? That way, we simply know if any of you forgets, it happens, we're human. You walk away with your clicker, we still have the ID, we can contact you. All right, we say, come get your ID and give us a clicker, okay? So please, when you take one of these being passed around, make sure you give your ID, if you want a clicker. Right. Alternately, you can give your phones. Actually, that's what we should do. Have everyone give in their phones, so they, none of that, right? Good. So I'll give you a few minutes to settle down with that. Okay, so I'm going to just repeat that very briefly for those who are coming in now. So we have clickers for this lecture. There's about 10 clickers per section. If you want to make use of a clicker, share it with your friends, obviously. You can share one amongst 2 or 3 of you. Whoever takes the clicker, please give us your AUB ID, because in the past, unfortunately, we've had clickers not returned. So that way, at the end of the lecture, you give back the clicker and get back your ID. And in case you forget, we know who you are and we can hunt you down. In the most pleasant manner. We will hunt you down in the most pleasant manner, honestly. You know, friendly reminders and gentle reminders. Right? Hey, Mahmoud, any email that begins with gentle reminder, you know, it's not gentle. I apologize, my vocal cords seem to be giving out slowly. We're good? Okay. Okay. I think I can start because the early stages we don't need the clickers. Hopefully by the time I get to the clickers, they would have been distributed to those who wish to hold them. So a couple of weeks ago we had a presentation on, if you remember, on Ibn Rushd and Maimonides, and this whole kind of emphasis on the bringing in of Aristotelian philosophy, Aristotelian reasoning within a monotheistic context. I think we did a bit of an illustration with the works of Ibn Rushd and the works of Maimonides, and I hope by now you've done quite a bit of that in your classes to see how they are utilizing Aristotelian philosophy. Today we'll pick up from that and go further into the Western tradition of that same kind of approach, which we reference as the medieval synthesis, right? The medieval synthesis being the synthesizing of the monotheistic revelation and truth therein revealed on the one hand, and the truth of reason and philosophy, mostly expressed through Aristotelian philosophy, on the other hand. And in the Western tradition, that takes on a huge life of its own, and under the heading of scholastic philosophy or scholasticism. And that's why our running headline for today is scholasticism. But of course, our focus will be on the author you'll be dealing with, which is Tommaso d'Aquino, St. Thomas of Aquinas, and what we're referencing here as the medieval synthesis. Right? So what I want to start with is actually a quick reference to that kind of almost introductory, sorry, let me just battle with this, right? So we have an introductory painting here, not really from the era under discussion, not the medieval era, but the 19th century. It's a painting by Ludwig Seitz, which I think does very well in capturing what we'll be talking about with St. Thomas Aquinas in terms of the synthesis between reason and faith, or reason and revelation. In fact, the title of the painting is very telling. Reason and faith and reason united, right? And what you have here is a representation of reason and faith in discussion, right? Very cordial discussion. And an inscription at the top is actually by Pope Leo XIII, and it reads, "The splendor of the divine truths received in the mind helps the understanding," right? So divine truth received in the mind. A final quick introductory note using this painting is you might notice there's figures in the grayscale behind reason and revelation, both on your right-hand side and left-hand side. And I'll just say this. In both cases, you have someone teaching. And in both sides, that is actually Thomas Aquinas, right? Your author that you'll be reading. So he is in many ways exemplary, if you wish, at least in the scholastic tradition, of this faith and reason united, as he is represented here behind reason and behind faith as the teacher, very much actually receiving the title the angelic doctor for most of his work in this synthesis. So the aims of today's lectures is to say something about this broad headline of scholasticism in which we're going to be placing your readings from Thomas Aquinas, and say something about the general kind of development, so a bit of a historical context, not much I hope, and then we'll move on to some close encounters with certain aspects and perhaps even selections from the two readings you have from Thomas Aquinas, because you're covering selections from two different works of his, the Summa Contra Gentiles and the Summa Theologia. And so we'll say a bit about both. So first a word about scholasticism, and as I have it spelled out there on your fly sheet, the term really references the schoolmen, right? The scholastic, the learned schoolmen. And it references the schoolmen of Europe, with whom this kind of school of thought develops, in terms of being this school of thought which I like to reference as the medieval synthesis, the synthesizing of Aristotelian philosophy with the church or the teachings of the fathers, all right, Augustine and others. Historically, scholasticism has not received very high praise, perhaps on the contrary. Already, as you start to exit, so to speak, historically, the medieval era, the Renaissance already starts to reflect and critique very negatively what we're calling here the scholastic tradition or scholastic philosophy. And in fact, in many ways, the Renaissance could perhaps be seen as a reaction against the medieval era. The medieval, by the way, the term medieval simply means medieval, i.e. the Middle Ages. But of course, they become also called the Dark Ages. And one imagines it wasn't the people in the medieval era who used that name, it was the people after them. And so just as an exemplar here, we have this short reference by Laurentius Valla, the 15th century Italian humanist, who says of the scholastics that they are that superstitious and senseless race of professors who make their pupils swear never to contradict Aristotle. Very, I think, clearly evaluative statement that carries on all the way, just as another example, to the 19th century with Hippolyte Taine, a 19th century French critic and historian, who speaks about the 3 centuries of scholastic thought as the 3 centuries at the bottom of that gloomy abyss and which did not add a single idea to man's intellectual inheritance. Rather harsh, perhaps, statements. I put this before you because I think one of our challenges in reading scholastic philosophy is to actually see the other side of it. And I hope in today's lecture we can see a bit more of the positive evaluations of scholasticism and the aims and purposes and indeed the methods of the medieval synthesis, right? Now, before we do that, I want to, I'm going to ask you to, I'm assuming now we have the clickers out there, indulge me in 2 quick exercises. Sorry, that shouldn't be there, but you know, I'll read the question, which is it's covering. Basically, I'd like you to engage with me in an imagine if you will exercise. And the imagine if you will says the following. Imagine you were a person of monotheistic faith, of some authority, and one who has just been recently informed of the discovery of a great corpus, of a great body of works in a language other than yours, in a language of times past. And there's a certain suspicion that this great body of works contains an immense treasure of wisdom, an immense treasure of great wisdom of the past. Right? And this discovery has just been brought to you. And you have to decide what to do. So what do? Do you procure the corpus and make sure that no word of such discovery gets out until you can figure out what to do with it? Or do you make sure that no word of such a discovery ever gets out and you destroy the books, you destroy the corpus? Or do you perhaps bring together a group of scholars to study and translate these works? Or do you procure the corpus and sell it to the highest bidder? At this stage, you can use your clickers with your friends, right? So, do you get the corpus and take your time, decide what to do with it? Do you get the corpus and destroy it, sell it, or get a group of guys to translate it and bring it into light? Not sure how many clickers we have out there, so I'll wait a bit. Oh, yeah, I don't. Okay, so I'm just trying to figure out at what number should I stop, because now we have 25 responses. We have more clickers out there? No, I mean out there. I think about 40. Okay. So I'll wait a bit more, because I don't want to, stop too much at these interjections, although I think they're interesting interjections. Okay, so 29, 30. 30 responses is good. All right, so let's see what the vote in this room with 31 responses is. All right, great, wow. So 6% of you would get the corpus, think about it, see what to do with this. All right, fair enough. 10% of you would destroy it. Fantastic, and save yourselves a reading in CVSP 202. 74% would bring together a group of scholars, translate, and see where to go from there. That's pretty decent. And 10% are entrepreneurs, are either in business or finance or economics. And, well, good thinking. Why not, right? Okay. So it's very good because, in fact, we can move from there to the next slide and now ask the following. So, all right, you know what? You go with the majority. You get a group of scholars. You start translating, studying the works. But here's what's happening. The more you translate and the more you study these works, the more you start to feel that a lot of the body, the content of these works may actually stand, I don't want to say in opposition to your worldview, but may challenge quite a bit of your worldview, may challenge quite a bit of the accepted worldview. And that's becoming clearer as you go along in your study and translation. So now what do? Right? Do you make a public announcement of the discovery and its contents, urging all people to re-examine their accepted worldview? Do you burn all the manuscripts and brand anyone who would mention them and their content as a criminal or a heretic or a zandiq or whatever your favorite word? Or do you continue studying them with this group of scholars and seek out from them what may indeed be of much use to re-evaluating or perhaps strengthening your worldview? Or do you cover up the fact that they were discovered, translated, and pretend they just got discovered and sell to the highest bidder? All right, so in the earlier poll, we stopped at 31, so for the sake of getting a more or less accurate picture, we'll again stop at 31. It may not be the same 31, but all right, so we're 27 responses, 28, okay? So what do? Burn them, heretic. Okay, so 31, no? Just 30? All right, ala uno. Okay, there we go. Okay, a slight shift, not much. It's pretty decent. So 16% now actually shift in the more positive sense. You know what, guys? We've discovered this great works, and I think we need to re-examine our worldview. Very 21st century of view. 10% would burn the manuscripts and heretic, etc. Wasn't it 10% earlier as well? So it could be just the same 10%. We haven't managed to convert anyone. 61% continue studying. The fact that the number dropped simply because A actually increased, but the sellers have also increased. So maybe it's time to start selling these works. And 13% would. Oh, this is great thinking and great result, actually, because this was actually more or less the situation in 11th century, early 12th century Spain, in Toledo, to be precise, with the beginnings of the reconquests of the Andalus, the Islamic Andalus. And with the advent of King Alfonso onto Toledo in 1085, that's what they discovered. They discovered in the great library of Toledo, which he had explicitly said, don't burn or touch any of the books, we want them preserved. What they discovered was the great works that they had thought lost up to that time, the great works of Aristotle, and the great works of many other philosophers, and more centrally of commentators and translators, such as Ibn Rushd and Maimonides, in fact. And the decision was precisely, get a group of people, let's start translating these works, and let's start studying them. And that was the revival, or the bringing back into the Western, if you wish, Christendom, the heritage, the Greek heritage, mostly represented through Aristotle here, right? And it was works that they had thought lost. And they started to study them, and they continued to study them, and from them developed what we headlined here today as the scholastic tradition. And it developed not only in Toledo in Spain, it kind of moved, courtesy of Google Earth, from Spain all the way around to kind of southern France, and particularly in Marseille and other places, and then onwards all the way down to Sicily in Italy, because Roger of Sicily, who was the ruler of Sicily of the time, was very much someone who was in favor of these various studies and pushing for the various studies and translations and whatnot. And in fact, perhaps coincidence, I'm not sure if there's a causal relation or not, but the movement took place in places where the three monotheistic faiths were existing more or less peacefully and harmoniously, and there's a lot of debate going on, as you saw at the time of Ibn Rushd and Maimonides and many others. And that continued all the way down to Palermo in Sicily. But not only there, it soon went also northwards. In Sicily, one of the greatest translations was the translation by William of Moerbeke of Aristotle's Metaphysics, and it is reported, we never know with these things, that he may actually have been on close friendship or at least correspondence with your author Thomas Aquinas. This tradition, or this translation, also shot upwards and got to the further up in France and in England, modern day UK, and etc. But of course, to suggest that the Toledo event was the trigger, and that's when everything started, is actually an historical oversimplification. To suggest that there was no interest in the Greeks and suddenly there was in the Western tradition, of course, is again an oversimplification. You already saw from a couple of weeks ago the interest of that in the Arab Islamic tradition, both Eastern and Western, but that was also there within the Christian monotheistic worldview. And I hope you already picked up on that in your readings of Augustine, certainly. So before we move on to look at this kind of tradition, just a refresher. Sorry, not a refresher, a wild guess question. So as I said, this movement shot up in Toledo and really expanded outwards. Now, if you were to take a wild guess of who was the main driving force behind this, who was the main patron, right, supporter behind this movement of translation in Toledo, who would you say it was? The common people of Toledo, or the political powers, or the archbishop, or the scholars and schoolmen of Toledo? Just a wild guess question. Right? So was it the common people, the political powers, the archbishop, or the schoolmen who were pushing for the study and translation of this great corpus? More hesitant responses? It's a wild guess. No one knows what you're voting. Just A, B, C, or D. Okay, almost at 30. 30 is when I'm going to move. So Mr. 31 or Miss 31, make sure you get in there. So now you're stopped. Clever. 29, 30, all right? Good, okay. Good, so 10%, very 21st century, would suggest that the common people of Toledo wish that it were. The political powers, one perhaps would imagine that you need the backing of the political powers, certainly. Yeah, the Archbishop of Toledo, would it be? It must have been the schoolmen the scholars. Actually, that's a misleading. I'm sorry. I mean, they get to be reference schoolmen later on. So actually, no. I'm sorry, D. It's not. It's the wrong answer. Actually, C is the correct answer. The Archbishop of Toledo, right? And I know to some of us it's counterintuitive, but that's why I wanted that question there. Because one of the main things you have to keep in mind is that when we speak about the schools and the universities, these are religious institutes. Right? And so the study of this corpus of Aristotle, the translation, was actually not only taking place within the religious institute, but was actually under the patronage and kind of encouraged, with generally a little caveat, right? A little qualifier. What goes on in the schools stays in the schools, right? Let's not talk about these things publicly. So there was very lively study in the schools. And I gave you a little hint earlier when I passed the picture of the cathedral, where it housed the translators in the 12th century, right? So that's where actually the translation started, in the cathedral, under the auspices of Archbishop Raymond, actually, of Toledo. Okay. So as I said, it would be a bit amiss to suggest that the Toledo event started at all. Of course, there was something already happening. Nothing comes out of a vacuum. But maybe not so structured and maybe not so institutionalized as what happens after the 11th century, 12th century in Spain. And so we go back to perhaps one of the earliest figures in this kind of study of philosophy within the monotheistic Christian tradition, and it's Boethius, of course, the 6th century Boethius, whose famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy, very much engagement. It's a dialogue, actually, with reason, with philosophy, in matters and questions of faith. 9th century, John Scotus Eriugena from Ireland, and it's very interesting because what got Boethius to start thinking about his work and even translating, not only writing, he was starting to feel that Latin was becoming more and more the lingua franca, and we may lose the Greek, and we may lose the understanding of the Greek text. So he started to translate the Greek texts into Latin. Up in Ireland, for a long time, even when Latin was the general language of the kind of lower geographical parts of Europe, Ireland was still using Greek as a language of education, and so John Scotus doesn't mean Scottish, by the way, it actually means Irish, studied Greek, and again was very much interested in the assimilation or the synthesis of Greek philosophy and Christian monotheism. This is one of his most famous quotes, perhaps, on the subject matter. He says, "Christ wears two shoes in the world, Scripture and nature. Both are necessary to understand the Lord. And at no stage can creation be seen as separation of things from God." Right? This holistic kind of vision, the metaphysics and the physical. Other figures, of course, perhaps most often referenced as the beginnings of the scholastic traditions, or perhaps the first scholastic philosopher, St. Anselm, and his very famous proofs for God's existence, the ontological proofs for God's existence, as he sets down in his works. A big figure there also in this kind of presenting the synthesis or the, kind of coexistence, more than coexistence, a synthesis of philosophical argumentation with faith. Abelard, very interesting and tragic figure also of his times. Another great example of the scholastic tradition as it develops now. Just to give you an idea of how insistent he was on the centrality of science and philosophy, he has a son and he calls him Astrolabe. Do you know what an astrolabe is? Yes, right? That thing you use to observe and measure stars. And I'm not sure it was the best choice of names for his son. I'm not sure if his son thought highly of that name, but he was that serious about the centrality of science and whatnot. Anyway, there's many, of course, and we can mention many, but we don't need to mention. You can all look that up. I just want to point your attention to Albertus Magnus there, a very important figure, and actually the figure with whom St. Thomas Aquinas studied in Paris, so a very important figure. And of course, Thomas Aquinas would go into this list. So just as a quick refresher on the painting we started with before we move to our discussion on Thomas Aquinas, who was in Zeit's painting in the grayscale background on both sides, behind reason and behind revelation? Was it Pope Leo XIII? Was it Thomas Aquinas? Was it Augustine of Hippo? Or was it Ibn Rushd, a.k.a. Averroes? This is an easy one, right? You're thinking, I wish this was graded. Right? Great. Bless you. Okay. So who was represented in Zeitz on both sides of the painting? Pope Leo, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, or Averroes. Okay, with 35 minutes left, that's very good. Okay, I'm going to go with 27, 28, 29. Yes, almost? You remember, don't you? Okay, I'm going to go with 28 responses. Good. 4% Pope Leo. Yeah, the inscription was from Pope Leo. You're right, but he wasn't in the painting. Of course, it was Thomas Aquinas. Augustine of Hippo might have been a good choice, but not, of course, as much as Thomas Aquinas. Ibn Rushd, haram. He doesn't appear in these paintings. He appears in a painting by Raphael, so that's pretty good. Right? The Academy, the School of Athens. Okay. So with that, we now move to a discussion of our author and selections from his text that you're reading. St. Thomas Aquinas, Tommaso d'Aquino. This is actually a 15th century copy of his Summa Theologia, the second part of the second book. Very, very briefly, in terms of bio, right? And I don't like to go into details. These days, bios are available at your fingertips. You can go online. But there's some interesting, perhaps, pointers. Of course, the fact that he was born is very interesting. So he's born in 1225 in Aquino. That's where he gets his name. As I mentioned earlier, Albertus Magnus, he went and studied with Albertus Magnus in Paris in 1245. And then he returns there later, actually, and where he obtains his doctorate of theology. He returns in 1253 and studies there as well. And he receives it in 1257. A central figure, obviously, in the development of scholasticism. In fact, the whole school of thought is named after him, Thomism, which for a while was very prominent, then went into a certain decline, then was very much revived in the 19th century and into the 20th century. Of course, it's not the only school, but we're talking about Thomas Aquinas, so we talk about the school that followed him, Thomism. You're reading selections from both the Summa Theologia and the Summa Contra Gentiles. It's very interesting that, as far as we know, the Summa Theologia was not finished, because it would seem that Aquinas, who in many of his, let's say, I don't like the word, so I'm going to put it between the doctrines or principles, was Augustinian actually, and influenced by the church fathers, of course, all of them. He has a certain personal experience, which almost is kind of analogous to that of the garden experience you encountered with Augustine here. It's in the tower experience. And after which he feels that much of anything he wrote was worth nothing compared to that singular experience. And so he decides to stop his writing. And he says to his secretary, Brother Reginald, he says, "I can write no more. All that I have written seems like straw," in the face of this experiential, personal kind of, direct experience. There's no other way to say it, really. Right? And he died in 1274 and was canonized about 50 years later, and he made a saint in 1323. And I just want to make that point, because a lot of my students have in the past said, how was he a saint? Remember, canonization or becoming a saint happens much later. So at this stage, it's just Tommaso when he's writing and living. So what is Tommaso's approach here, and what is the synthesis that you're going to be encountering, and how do you encounter it in these works? So as I said, you're reading very short selections, by the way. You'll see the extent of these works. You're reading short selections from these two works, the Summa Contra Gentiles and the Summa Theologia. And I just want to give you an idea of the extent of these works. So this is a summary of the Summa Contra Gentiles. You're reading from book 1. But it's actually 4 books, each of which is many chapters. Right? I think you're reading chapters 2 through 9 of book 1. Right? Book 1, which is under the large heading of God, is 102 chapters. Of creation, book 2 is 101 chapters. Of providence, 163 chapters. And of salvation, 97 chapters. And I also hope you can see the extent of the topics. Of course, if you were to go into the subheadings, I'll give you, here's a sampling, for instance. These are some of the chapter titles in there. Chapter 13, Arguments of Proof of the Existence of God, something you'll also see in the Summa Theologia. Chapter 20, that God is not a body, that God is his essence, chapter 21. 23, that no accident is found in God. Remember Maimonides? Right? Chapter 42, that God is one. chapter 65, that God knows singulars. Remember the debate between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd? Right? Well, between Al-Ghazali and the philosophers. Does God know particulars or only universals? That God knows singulars. That God has will. That God cannot will evil. Remember Augustine? Right? And many, many, of course, more. These are a very tiny sample. And throughout, what is most interesting is that he is essentially, as you'll see in a minute, when he presents the intent and the purpose of this work, he's addressing the doctrines and the creed, if you wish, the principles of the faith, but he's using the tools of philosophy in addressing these principles, in addressing these doctrines. These are your reading selections, right? So these are the titles of the chapters. I'm not going to go through them. You have them in your readings. And he begins in chapter 2 precisely under the heading of the author's intention in the present works. And he begins with the following statements on the pursuit of wisdom. And he writes, amongst all human pursuits, the pursuit of wisdom is more perfect, more noble, more useful, and more full of joy. Now, what would he mean by the pursuit of wisdom here? Any guesses? Knowledge in what sense? In the particular sense, right? Sure, knowledge of God, if you wish. Not sure he'll take you there. Can one know God through reason? Good question. Right? The book 1, the entirety of book 1 is under the heading on God. Right? Philosophia. What does it mean? The love of wisdom, right? Pursuit of wisdom. Philosophy factors in very clear with him. Very clear. Right? But not as a thing on its own, but as a tool in the service of the questions of faith and the truths of faith. Right? And he says, it is more perfect, i.e. the pursuit of wisdom, it is more perfect because insofar as a man gives himself to the pursuit of wisdom, so far does he even now have some share in true beatitude, right? Now, in this life. It is more noble because through this pursuit, man especially approaches to the likeness to God. Through this pursuit, we approach to a likeness to God, who made all things in wisdom. Voltaire, I don't know how accurate this is, but Voltaire is reported to have said, much later, of course, in the 18th century France, he says, religion brings God down to man, philosophy takes man up to God. Pursuit of wisdom approaches to a likeness to God. It is more useful because through wisdom we arrive at the kingdom of immortality. And it is more full of joy because her conversation with wisdom, hath no bitterness, nor her company any tediousness, but joy and gladness. And the Boethius' text is all about a conversation with wisdom, with philosophy, by the way. And then he sets down clearly the aim of this work. And he says, right, so we're not left guessing as to why he's writing this text. He says, and so in the name of the divine mercy, I have the confidence to embark upon the work of a wise man, even though this may surpass my powers, and I have set myself the task of making known, so far as my limited powers will allow, the truth that the Catholic faith professes, and of setting aside the errors that are opposed to it. Right? So this is the purpose of the work. Right? To make known. And knowledge here takes us back to, whether knowledge of God, as one of you represented, or knowledge of providence, or etc. But knowledge, as you'll see in this sense for him, will be using certain tools of philosophy. Not in all questions. This is very important, and we'll make the distinction very clear. In some questions. Right? So to make known, as far as my limited powers will allow, and this is a very central qualifier that many in the philosophical tradition use all the way from Aristotle onwards, that philosophy is the pursuit of truth in as far as possible for man. Right? The truth that the Catholic faith professes, and setting aside the errors that are opposed to it. So dual purpose, if you wish. Right? Then he moves directly, since we're talking about to make known these truths, what are the ways in which divine truth is to be made known? Right? And the ways here are really, you can summarize them as two, if you wish. Right? The ways of reason and the ways of revelation. You saw this with Maimonides, you saw this with, of course, Ibn Rushd. You see something similar here. The difference is in the kind of spectrum in which he will allow the application of reasoning, and where he will say, no, this is not the application of reasoning, as you see. So he writes, he says, the way of making truth known is not always the same, and as the philosopher has very well said, it belongs to an educated man to seek such certitude in each thing as the nature of that thing allows. Right? So the nature of the thing being sought, being searched after, will define for you the method of seeking it. Certain things, by their nature, are open to rational demonstration, are open to rational meditation, and certain other things are not. So the nature of the thing guides the method which you will use, or the way in which it will be known. And here he sets down very clearly. He says there is a twofold mode of truth in what we profess about God. Some truths about God exceed all the ability of the human reason. Such is the truth that God is triune, right? The Trinity. Augustine very clearly states that and grapples with it. Later on, you're coming to Dante, you'll see how he will deal with it, or the conversation between Virgil and Dante addressing the question of the triune, right? So some truths about God, to go back to knowing God, some truths about God exceed all the ability of the human reason. In some, these are issues of essence, of divine essence. Because as you saw earlier, in one of the chapters I mentioned, the chapter is that God is his essence. Right? And if you remember with Maimonides, rationally it's not possible to know God's essence. But there are some truths which the natural reason also is able to reach. Such are that God exists, that God is, that he is one. Again, remember Maimonides, how he presents it, and the like. In fact, such truths about God have been proved demonstratively by the philosophers, guided by the light of natural reason. Right? So here you see very clearly the emphasis on the role of reason in addressing some truths about God, and certain truths cannot be known by the light of reason. Right? You also see very clearly something of an echo of what you encountered with Ibn Rushd. And this is not for everyone. He says up there, it belongs to an educated man to seek such certitude in each thing, etc. Right? And you'll see this develop further and explicated further in the reading selections you have from the Summa Contra Gentiles, right? In which he puts down that these truths which are revealed may also be accessed by reason, but there's a good reason that these truths which are accessible by philosophical reasoning are also revealed, right? And that some truths cannot be accessed by philosophical reasoning and must only be accepted upon revelation. Does that make sense? Right? Because you can imagine somebody saying, well, look, if I can attain such truths that God is, that he exists, and that he is one, if I can attain such truths through reason, why reveal it? Why does God reveal his presence? Why does God reveal his existence? Isn't that just faith, whereas this is knowledge, right? To know. And isn't knowing the existence of God more kind of solid and more powerful than believing in the existence of God? So why would God reveal certain truths to us that are available to us through reason? I'm not going to answer that question. He will. Right? That's in your readings. And then you can switch it around and say, but if these truths are revealed, why should I seek them through reason? Khalas, they're revealed. God has revealed his being. He has revealed his being a unity, a simple unity. And he's revealed his mercy, and he's revealed his essence. So khalas, why should I now utilize reason? Again, I won't answer the question. I'll allow Aquinas to answer it in your readings. Right? And then the third question therein attaches to the first set of truths there, that some truths about God exceed all the ability of human reason. Why? Right? Why didn't God just give us the kind of reason that would be capable of addressing all there is to know about God? Right? Why were we given this reason? Because this is given to us by God, this intellect. Why did God give us the kind of intellect that will be able to grapple with certain truths about the divine, but not other truths? Again, Aquinas will answer that. A quick question, and again, it's a kind of a wild guessing question. Throughout the works you'll be reading, and actually if I go back, you'll see it. He says the philosopher. Aquinas references the philosopher. Right? In your translations, there's always capitalized P, the philosopher. Who could he be referencing? He says the philosopher said this, and the philosopher said that. Who do you think Aquinas is referencing when he makes that, when he uses that term? Is he referencing Plato, Aristotle, Augustine of Hippo, or Ibn Rushd, aka Averroes? The philosopher. الفيلسوف. التعريف. Because he also speaks about philosophers, right? Or a philosopher may say this. But the philosopher has said. Okay? 28, 29 is good, yeah? All right. Let's see. Goody, goody, yes. Aristotle, of course Aristotle, the philosopher, right? Remember what Hippolyte Athene, or rather Lorenzo Valla, had criticized the scholastics, right? Those breed of professors who make their students swear never to contradict Aristotle, right? And this kind of Aristotle is everything, and all that is worth studying has already been studied by Aristotle, and if he hasn't studied it, then it's not worth studying. This is, of course, a cliché and total falsification of the attitude of the medievalists, but there you go. So yes, of course, it's Aristotle. Of course, it's Aristotle. He does reference, actually, 7%, yes, he does reference Ibn Rushd, but not as the philosopher. If and when he does, it's the commentator. Right? That's the famous reference for Ibn Rushd. Okay. With that exercise, we now move to the selections you also have from the Summa Theologia. And again, I'd like you to get kind of an idea of how immense this work is. Right? You're reading selections from, I believe, part 1. The second question is what you're reading. Okay? So this, again, is in 4 parts plus a supplement. Sorry, 4 parts including the supplement, pardon. Part 1 is 119 questions, literally. They're questions and their answers, and they're divided onto various treatises. Part 2, and that's why I always think of it as 4, because part 2 is in 2 parts. So the first part of part 2 and the second part of part 2. And together, you have 303 questions being addressed under 15 treatises. Part 3 has 7 treatises and 90 questions. And then you have a supplement with 5 treatises and 2 appendices, and 102 questions in total. And the final appendix and the final question, very, very relevant to your next author, is a question on purgatory, whether there is a life after death, which is neither hell nor heaven, but a purgatory, what some of the Mu'tazila had referenced in the Islamic world as the station between the 2 stations, right? Neither heaven nor hell. Again, some sample questions addressed just to give you, and again, an idea of the richness and the variety and the extent of the issues he raises here. So from the first part, question number 11 on the unity of God. Number 13, the names of God, the big discussion for Maimonides, if you remember. Big discussion for much of the philosophers in the Arab Islamic tradition. And the power of God, omnipotence, the power of God. From the first part of the second part, what is happiness? Now more kind of human-centered, right? Of the cause of love in us, of the external causes of sin, right? The second part of charity, considered in itself, of the gift of wisdom, of justice, of gluttony. Guilty? Any of you guilty here? You'll see it in Dante. You'll know why I'm guilty. And of the grace of the miracles. Again, the issue of miracles, big debate between many of these philosophers / theologians, thinkers. The third part, of Christ's unity of being, of the causality of Christ's resurrection, very pertinent as we now approach Easter, of course, of the effects of baptism. And then in the supplement, you have on the nature of the confession and of matrimony as a sacrament, right? The sirr al-zawaj, right? And these are just, again, really samplers. And all of these, of course, at the very heart of Christian monotheistic faith as he understands it, right, was he's referring as Catholic. But again, with all of these, his approach is through the tools of philosophy, through the tools of Aristotelian reasoning. And throughout, he will suggest, or he will say very clearly, where philosophy will fall short, how far I can go with this, and where it will say, I can't take you there, right? This is, for instance, very clear in the third part on the discussion of the divine persons, the Trinity. Right? And he's already told us this is something beyond reason. So what you're reading then is question 2 of the first part, right, of 100-something questions. And the question has to do with the existence of God. And I will give some attention here now in the remaining 5 minutes just to illustrate not only his arguments, you'll do a lot of that in class, but his method. And this is a very good illustration of the scholastic method of thinking, right? At least as set by Thomas Aquinas in this work, right? So there's certain methodology he will follow, which we'll clarify in a moment. So the second question, right, in the series of questions, is on the existence of God. And it's broken down into 3 articles that need to be addressed. The first article is whether the proposition God exists is self-evident. And the fool says there is no God. This is something that St. Anselm had worked with in the past. And the second article is whether God's existence is demonstrable, i.e. can be proven. And the third article is whether God exists. And of course it follows. So if, for instance, we can show that the proposition God exists is self-evident, then you don't need to prove it. It's evident. It's self-evident. It's evidence for itself. Right? As you see with the progression of the questions, he will show that it's not self-evident and therefore needs to be proven, needs to be demonstrated. Which takes us to the next article. Well, can it? Can one prove the existence of God? And you'll see the arguments there. And then he reaches a conclusion that yes, it can be demonstrated. Well, fine then. Prove it. Is there a God? Right? So that's the progression. Right? The methodology goes as follows. First, I will set down the antithesis. These, in your readings, are under objections. And I'm making this note because some of my students in the past have had a little difficulty with this. These are not Aquinas' objections. These are the objections to which he's responding. So this is the antithesis. It's not his thesis. Right? Those who say that God's existence is self-evident say it in one of these 3 manners. Right? Does that make sense? So the objections are not his. The replies are his. Right? He says, on the contrary, I reply. Okay? So first he sets down the antithesis and examines it. And this is very, very brilliant professional academic approach. Because if the antithesis works, if they're right, then khalas. What's more to be said? If it's correct that God's existence is self-evident in accordance with one of these objections, then all right, it's self-evident. Okay? So he sets them down, he examines them. These are the 3 objections, right? So either, for instance, as Yohanna Dimashqi, John of Damascene, had said that the knowledge of God is naturally implanted in all of us. We all know there's God, right? Or as soon as the name God is understood, it exists mentally, it also follows that it exists actually. And this is kind of following from St. Anselm's ontological argument, right? That once you know what God, the name denotes, then it must necessarily exist, etc. Again, I'm not going to go into the details. Suffice it to say that he will respond to these. And he will respond saying, actually, God's existence is not self-evident. Right? And in summary, is the following. If something is self-evident, it would not be possible for you to say the contrary. Does that make sense? The fact is, I can say the contrary. I can say there's no God. The fact that I can say the contrary means it's not self-evident. Does that make sense? Right? So, the opposite of the proposition God is can be mentally admitted. The fool said in his heart there is no God. Therefore, that God exists is not self-evident. Okay? Self-evidence is a very strong and special case of the certitude of something. Right? Very few things are self-evident. Actually, maybe nothing. Right? According to Descartes, only one thing. So the fact that I can deny God's existence shows that God's existence is not self-evident. And the fact that it's not self-evident means I need to prove it. Enter the second set of objections. Right? Sorry. You can't prove it. Yeah, you need to prove it, but you can't prove it for the following reasons. Right? So one of them, for instance, is the following, and I'm referencing the third objection. The third objection says to prove something, the existence of X, we work backwards from the effect, right? To prove that there is fire, right? We look at the effects of fire, or that there was fire. So we go back from the effects to the cause. Now the problem here is that the nature of the effects, material, tangible, in this world, observable by us, and the supposed nature of the cause, immaterial, metaphysical, transcendental, are so disparate, are so totally different, that there's no way you can go from looking at the effects and trace back towards the cause. It's not possible because of the difference in nature, right? So you can't prove God's existence by studying his effects, right? A response from Aquinas is, yes, this would be a good objection if I was working from the effects to understand the cause, to know the cause, the essence. Yes, the disparity between the material effects and the immaterial cause are so huge, there's no way I can study the effects to understand the essence of the cause. However, I can, from studying effects, posit that there is a cause, that there exists a cause, right? And so God, the existence of God can be demonstrated. Sorry. Okay. So there's obviously more in there, and I just want to leave you very, very briefly with this conclusion. And do make sure you give back your ID and take your clickers if you're taking clickers, by the way. So in sum, I just want to read as a conclusive remark from a work called Aristotle's Children by Richard Rubinstein, in referencing this kind of whole era and scholastic era, etc. And he says, in reliving the Aristotelian revolution, we understand that we are not just the children of Copernicus and Galileo, Adam Smith and Thomas Jefferson, but Aristotle's children. The heirs of a medieval tradition that seems more intriguing and inspiring as the shortcomings of modernity become clearer. Of course, most of us would not return to the Middle Ages if we could. Few people today would embrace the assumptions and conclusions of the medieval scholastics. But the Aristotelians' quest for meaning is also ours, and we have much to learn from their vision of a science infused by ethics and a religion unafraid of reason. In this little known but formative chapter of our history, we may detect hints of a more humane and integrated global future. Thank you for your attention.